So this is me. Brian already kind of gave you a little bit of a background. I'm going to try to fit it in 5 minutes. However, I think I might go over. I'm sorry. So a little bit of a background of, this is awesome, by the way. Never mind. A little bit of a background of why I chose to do this talk. So when Girl Developer asked me to do the lightning talk, it was, I was kind of thinking, well, what can I tell them? What do I know really, really well? And I remembered that a while ago I took this class online that was about effective thinking, and they outlined these 5 habits that you can adapt to be like a better problem solver. The first one was you want to understand your basics. You want to understand simple things really deeply. Even if you think you know something, just go back and really dig into it, and they guarantee you're going to find something you don't know. And then there were others like fail, so make mistakes, don't be afraid. Raise questions, so question yourself, question others, just don't ever settle, and then follow the flow of ideas. So even if you think that something's at a dead end, just follow through and see where it takes you. And the final one was change. So all those principles above, if it stops working and you find something better, just change it. Just be agile about it. But the first one really stuck with me because I tend to breeze through things and I think, oh, I know this. So I started working with JavaScript more this year, and I had this grandiose idea that I knew, moderately well, at least the basics, right? I know my objects. Turns out I don't. Well, I kind of know them, sort of. So this presentation was sort of my chance to learn them by explaining it to somebody else. So here it goes. JavaScript data types, right? We have our basic immutable data types, and we have our objects. And objects are really interesting, and they also, you can't really go without them if you're going to make anything bigger than just responding to click events on a page. And the reason that I gravitate towards objects is partially because I have a Java background, so that just sounds familiar to me, and I like classes, I like objects. But turns out that JavaScript objects are even more peculiar than what I was expecting. So what's an object? We know that, right? Just little object is this, and then we can set properties on it. So let's try doing it in the console. Okay? And then we can access them by just saying mass or whatever else you set. So it's pretty much like an array, an associative array or a dictionary, a map, whatever you're used to. Well, they're a little bit more than that. Well, for starters, we can create them in a myriad of different ways, this being one of them if you're being lazy. Or if you, again, are like me, this looks really familiar, so I tend to prefer this using a new object. There's also the object create, but essentially all of these are creating identical objects. Now, there's something like a constructor function. So this is a little bit different. So let's see what happens when we use that. Syntax error. Thank you. There we go. All right, so we made 2 objects. We've pretty much used similar constructor, but if we inspect them, we'll notice some differences. Okay, so this was the one that we just used the object literal for, and this object A was the one we used the construction function for. So first of all, notice their types are different. Can you see it all right? Okay. First of all, the one we use the object literal for is just type object. The other one is type little object. Well, they both have mass and speed, so what's the big deal? Well, they both have this hidden prototype, and one is object, the other one is a little object. When I first heard of prototypes, I knew that there's the usual spiel of, oh, this is how inheritance works in JavaScript, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, I get that. Well, it's not like Java, is what I learned. For once, this is an instance of an object, right? So prototype of a little object is not the function itself, it's an instance. And I'll get to what the difference is in a little bit. Okay. So proto versus prototype. If we inspect our actual little object constructor function, we'll notice that it also has a prototype here, but it also has a prototype property. I don't know why they named it that. I guess it makes sense, but it took me a while to wrap my head around what is the prototype and what is the proto, okay? So proto, which is this hidden property of every object, is basically pointing to its parent, right? And I like to think of objects in terms of families. I like to kind of humanize them like that. So every object in JavaScript has a prototype, right? And then every constructor function has a prototype property, which is, well, if you're using that constructor function to create an object, that's what's going to be, this is what's going to be set as the object's prototype. I really tried to come up with a shorter way of saying it, but if you have a shorter way of saying it, please let me know, because I couldn't come up with it. But essentially, if we look at our example, when we have our little object function that has a prototype of little object, and we have our object A, which was created using that function, and these two, the prototype of object A and the prototype property of the function, are one and the same instance, okay? So let's see, why do we care, right? Why do we want to inherit things? Well, let's say that we created a dozen objects, a dozen little objects using the constructor function, and then we added a say hi function to the prototype. Now, because of inheritance, our object A is going to inherit that from its prototype, if we actually call it. Hello. Okay? Well, one question I had was, all right, so why would I put that prototype in here, right? Why wouldn't I just say, well, I'll just define it on the function, right? We used it to create the object, so it should inherit it. You would think, maybe? Let's try it. Clear it a little bit. All right? So just do the same thing we did before, but we'll call the by function. And there's an error. So what's happening here? Let's explore our little object function again. So notice that the say by function is defined on the function, whereas the say hi function is on the prototype. Now, this is the one piece that I had to really remember, is that the only link between the constructor function and the object is the prototype that was used, right? So the prototype property that points to an object, and then the object that's created, that's the only link between the function and the object. And even though you're adding things to the function after that, it's not really affecting the object. Just realized I said object like 10 times in that sentence. Okay. So that's not going to work. But if we just want to add a function to the object itself, and want a method to the function itself, we can do that. It's just not going to do anything for its children. So prototype chaining, right? It's probably something you've heard before. If you haven't, it's just a way to create an ancestry in objects. So let's say I wanted to create a big object function, and then I want to make it the prototype of little object. Now, remember we created object A using this constructor function. But now that we're changing the prototype, any objects we create beyond that are going to use this object instead, okay? So if we inspect object B and object A, we'll notice that they're different. Little object A, all right, and B. Now, remember we made them using the same function. The only difference is that one had the prototype set at the beginning as little object, and the other one we changed to be the big object. So they inherit different things. Now, if we do object A and we get the name of it, we're going to get undefined. But if we do the same thing with object B, it's actually going to get the big name from the little object B. All right? Okay, and that really brings me to my last point about own versus inherited properties. Let's look at object B in a little bit more detail. So if we ask it if it owns the property of mass, which was what it inherited from the little object, it's going to say yes, because that was its own property, right? So that's what it owns. But if we do the same thing with name, which was from its prototype, it's going to say false. So even though we can access it, it's not its own property. I don't know what the practical implications of this are, except for you can really play around with it, and you can really explore these relationships and go back to your roots and see if you can find something new, because I guarantee you'll probably discover something you haven't heard before. And that's it. Thank you.